Welcome to the latest edition of Talking Data. Our Talking Data series seeks to offer timely insights into macro market themes along with macro data and its impact on the economy and markets. I'm Kristen Radosh of Arbor Research and Trading, and I will be your host today. Jim Bianco of Bianco Research will be providing an update today on the Georgia Senate race. Jim, get us started. I know we're less than a week away right now, so what is the latest?
Okay, so for those that are not into the weeds on this, the Senate right now is currently 50 Republicans, 46 Democrats, 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats. So it's 50-48. We have the 2 seats in Georgia that are up for election. The regular election, which is David Perdue, who is the Republican incumbent running against Jon Ossoff. And then we have a special election, Kelly Loeffler, who is the incumbent Republican running against Raphael Warner. The special election, by the way, is because Johnny Isakson was the senator from Atlanta. Last year, 2019, he resigned his seat because he's in ill health. The governor, Brian Kemp, a Republican, appointed Kelly Loeffler to take over his seat. But Georgia law says that the next available opportunity, you have to stand for a special election. That's why they had 2 elections this go around. By the way, for those that are interested, Kelly Loeffler's husband is Jeffrey Spector. He is the chairman of the Intercontinental Exchange and the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange as well, too. So there's a big Wall Street tie-in with her there as well. Georgia law says that you need to get 50% +1 in order to win in the general election. Neither candidate did, no candidate did, which is why we have a 2-person runoff in 2 elections on next Tuesday. And those 2 elections, because it's 50-48, will determine the majority in the Senate. If the Democrats win both seats, it'll be 50-50, and Kamala Harris, the vice president, will break the tie. If the Republicans win at least 1 seat, then they'll be the majority, and they'll appoint Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. Biggest thing about being the majority leader is you get to decide what gets voted on, and you get to decide when it gets voted on. So the majority leader's got a lot of power. They could decide, oh, all these things that we favor, we're going to vote on. All the things that you favor that we might lose in the vote, sorry, we're having a hard time finding time to actually get around to voting on it as well. So that's why it matters who is the Republican, who is the majority. Currently, it is Republican right now, and it's the Republicans to lose.
How do the polls look right now, and also the betting markets?
Yeah, okay, so a lot of people have been looking at the polls. If you're watching us on YouTube, I got a slide up here. If you're not, I'll explain it. And it shows on the left, it shows the general election, and on the right, it shows the special election. So you can see how the polls look. And they're largely a mixed bag because I've got them highlighted when the Republican leads in red, and I've got them highlighted when the Democrat leads in blue. And you can see they're going back and forth. In the general election, Perdue seems to be leading more polls than Ossoff. Although when Ossoff is leading, he leads by a bigger margin. In the special election, Loeffler was getting more polls earlier, but lately Warnock has been getting more polls. Regarding the polls, it's interesting also to note how they were played out before the November 3rd election. So going into the November 3rd election, let's take like the general election, the regular election. Ossoff was leading in a lot of the late polls going into November 3rd, but Perdue actually got more votes than Ossoff. So the polls were too pro-Democrat or not pro-Republican enough. In the Georgia special election, this was a little different. There were 20 candidates in the race. So no one was expected to get 50%. But Warnock was leading by 14 points over Kelly Loeffler. He only beat her by 7 points in that race, and no poll had it that close. So again, it was Republicans outperformed the polls, or the Democrats underperformed the polls on November. Your other question was about the betting. You can see the next slide I've got here is just a graphic to just show you that technically, if you average the polls, the Democrat is leading, but it's within the margin of error. You'd have to be plus 3% in order to be outside the margin of error. Ossoff is 1% above, and Warnock is 1.9% above. So this is a statistical tie. You asked about the betting markets. I'm a big fan of the betting markets. I think what they do is they take all available information and they synthesize it into one probability. It doesn't tell you who's going to win, but they can be wrong, and they can be wrong for the same reason the polls are wrong. But if you want to know what the consensus is, or if you want to know where divergences are, the betting markets are a great place to look. So the chart you're looking at now is the predicted.org betting site, largest betting site for politics. And it shows right now which party will control the Senate after the 2020 elections, which next Tuesday will be the final set of it. 69% chance it will be a Republican Senate, Republican majority. 34% chance it will be a Democrat majority, even though the polls are a statistical tie with a slight lean towards the Democrats. The betting markets are leaning heavy Republican. So they're diverging some with the polls. For those that have been watching, we talked that this exact thing happened in the general election with the presidential race, in that the polls said, it's over, we're just deciding how big a rout Biden would have. And the betting market said, no, this is going to be really close, but Biden should win. And the betting markets were largely right. The betting markets got 49 of the 50 states right in the presidential election. The pollsters didn't. And the pollsters, just like with the Georgia race, were systematically overestimating Democrats up and down the line, underestimating Republicans. Nate Silver, the modeler that uses polls, likes to say, well, the polls were just outside the margin of error, and that's to be kind of a typical year. Yes, but all the mistakes were in the same direction. If it was a normally distributed mistake, some of the polls were too Democrat, some of the polls were too Republican, some of the polls were on, and if you averaged them all together, the error rate was the same as we had now, you'd say, okay, that's a typical year. But this year was all the polls were too pro-Democrat, and a lot of the polls were too underestimating the Republicans. That's the systematic error that we've had, and that's why I think the betting market is betting that we still have that systematic error as well too, going into this race. Final thought for you, at least on this part here. How important is this race? It will be the most expensive race in American history that is not a presidential election. Somewhere near $500 million is going to be spent since November 3rd on these two Senate races. No other election other than a presidential election has seen this much money and this much attention, because the entire majority of the Senate is riding on it, and the entire, at least first 2 years of the Biden presidency and his agenda will be dictated next Tuesday based on who wins in the Georgia Senate race and whether and who has the majority in the Senate.
How did this all look before November 3rd?
Yeah, November 3rd, if the chart you're looking at now is still the betting market chart. The red line shows you that the Democrats, or the Republicans were below 50% and the Democrats were above 50%. The betting markets were aligned with the polls pre-November 3rd, thinking that the Democrats would wind up picking up enough seats to be the majority. They didn't. They underperformed. They only net picked up one seat. That was the Alabama seat won by Tubby Tuberville, the former Auburn head football coach. He beat Doug Jones, the Democrat, in his race. And right after Election Day, the betting markets flipped, that there was a majority now expecting the Republicans to hold in the Senate as well too. So the betting markets they can get it wrong just as much as the polls can get it wrong. But what's different now is they, like I mentioned before, they seem to be looking at the polls. And as far as I could tell from looking at the polls, no pollster has changed their methodology since November 3rd. And the betting markets are saying, see, you guys, you got it wrong before November 3rd. You were too pro-Democrat. You still are. That's kind of where the betting market is set up right now, that you're too pro-Democrat, that this will be very close, but they expect that the Republicans will squeak this out. And we only got 6 more days to find out whether or not they're right or not. Understanding that, at least in the presidential election, the betting markets were, to use a golf analogy, closer to the pin than the polls were then.
Any final thoughts since we're less than a week away?
Thankfully, we're just less than a week away. The only other thing I think you see is, to quote the famous philosopher Warren Zevon, send lawyers, guns, and money, that there's going to be a lot of that going down to Georgia after Tuesday. And even though we might have an election on Tuesday and we might count a lot of votes on Tuesday, we're going to get a lot of lawyers, a lot of guns, and a lot of money coming in that's going to fight this thing in court either way. And we'll have to see whether or not they have a more credible case to suggest that the outcome is tainted than, say, President Trump has had to date in court. He's been going to court saying that certain states have been biased against him. Maybe, maybe not, but he's been having a very difficult time, making a convincing case of that. You'll expect to see some version of that probably after Tuesday in Georgia.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Appreciate your thoughts today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. As a reminder, Arbor Research and Trading is an institutional research and brokerage firm that produces innovative research across a broad range of fixed income, equity, currency, and commodity markets. For any questions, please contact Gus Handler at gus.handler@arborresearch.com.